So this talk is Relativity Principle does not make sense. Alternative title could be that Relativity Principle needs revising. Because the different things stated as the Relativity Principle are often wrong or ambiguous and vague and open to being easily misinterpreted. First, let's look at a few things said about Relativity Principle. This is Professor Norton, who studies the history and philosophy of physics about relativity, quantum theory, and statistical physics, with a special interest in general relativity. And he says, in 1918, Einstein proclaimed that the foundations of his general theory of relativity lay in three principles: the principle of equivalence, the generalized principle of relativity, and Mach's principle. For a long time, an understanding of the foundations of the general theory of relativity seemed to require elucidation of the content of each of the principles. That elucidation proved elusive, as it gradually emerged that much of Einstein's account of the nature of these principles did not sustain scrutiny, or that Einstein's own intentions were quite different from what the later literature reported. So there is this variation in what the principle of relativity and the other principles means. Wikipedia says certain principles of relativity have been widely assumed in most scientific disciplines. One of the most widespread is the belief that any law of nature should be the same at all times, and scientific investigations generally assume that the laws of nature are the same regardless of the person measuring them. These sorts of principles have been incorporated into scientific inquiry at the most fundamental of levels. So all that means is there are different principles of relativity. Wikipedia doesn't go into sufficient detail to say what they are, but the main principle of relativity dealing with here is that from special relativity, and Wikipedia says, this is Wikipedia, it says, the special principle of relativity states that the physical laws should be the same in every inertial frame of reference, but they may vary across non-inertial ones. This principle is used in both Newtonian mechanics and the theory of special relativity. Its influence in the latter is so strong that Max Planck named the theory after the principle. So according to this Wikipedia, the principle of relativity in special relativity is the same principle of relativity as used in Newtonian mechanics. But of course all of these things are arguable. What Wikipedia gives may be disputed by others, and it's all moving goalposts, an issue I've dealt with in previous videos, and that means that relativists say different things about relativity and keep changing things. So moving on to what is the mess when talking about the principle of relativity. One of the sort of things I hear a lot is, and this is a general quote of what people say, in special relativity there is no preferred frame. The relativity principle absolutely prohibits the existence of such frames. Special relativity demands that all inertial frames be equivalent. and I think that is false. It's a myth. So, going with the general quote, preferred frames are prohibited in special relativity because of the relativity principle. I would say that is false and a myth. There are those who say preferred framed allowed in special relativity, and I'll give an example of Spoot, who's a physics Nobel laureate, and he says it does exist. So from the point of view saying there is no preferred frame in special relativity, that's just a misunderstanding of special relativity. Next, the claim that the relativity principle does not allow a preferred frame would just be a misstatement of the principle, because as I shall explain mathematically, I can choose a preferred frame if I want. So I'm going to break down this general quote into its parts. And the first part is, in special relativity there is no preferred frame. That statement is false, and you have to talk about different types of frame. The next part of the statement, the relativity principle absolutely prohibits the existence of such frames as the preferred frame. That is false as well. And then the next part of the quote, which is special relativity that demands that all inertial frames be equivalent. Yeah, that is the relativity principle. All inertial frames be equivalent. But getting from the statement to no preferred frame, that is a myth or falsehood and a misunderstanding of the relativity principle. So now I'm going to use the idea of mathematical modelling. And mathematical modelling is this sort of loop. You start from the real world, you have a real world problem, you then go from that to the mathematical world where you set up a mathematical problem, and then you go to the next step, you make assumptions, and then you identify, construct a mathematical model, which is basically usually just a few equations, and then you interpret solutions and results from the data using the mathematics. You then apply that to the real world solution, and then you compare that to what you've got in the real world, and if you still think there's a problem with that, you go around the cycle once again. You go back to forming the mathematical problem, making more assumptions and so forth. So you just keep going around in this loop until your mathematics conforms to the experiments you have and the data, so forth. So against this idea that the relativity principle prohibits one inertial frame preferred over any other inertial frame, and what seems to be ignored in such statements, if a person has a preferred preference for one inertial frame, then he will use that way as a datum. Suppose giving two inertial frames A and B, they move at constant non-zero velocity v with respect to each other. As part of the mathematical modelling process, would it seem possibly that A is the preferred frame and that B initially was at rest with respect to A, but then later accelerated away, thus B is not really an inertial frame as had experienced non-inertial motion in its past, thus A is preferred frame over B. Seems nothing in mathematical modelling process that would deny us setting up a mathematical model that way, so the claim of no preferred frame is absurd. So reiteration it, suppose that relativity principle means no preferred frame. Contrast that with, but mathematically I can choose one inertial frame over any other inertial frame as what I want to call a preferred frame in my mathematical model. So saying there is no preferred frame does not make sense. The statement there is no preferred frame is just false because mathematically I was able to do otherwise. Query then becomes, given the general quote, preferred frames are prohibited in special relativity because of the relativity principle, raises the question, who was the first person to say that? It seems to be yet another myth. This person, Rolf, in his paper explains that there are several myths about special relativity. He gives 2 examples, and I've dealt with that in other videos. So based upon that there are myths in special relativity, could say that saying there's no preferred frame is just another myth about special relativity and wrong. So, having prepared the groundwork to consider that there are many myths said about relativity, let's look at this website. And at this website, it's claiming relativity myths and other ideas. This site discusses some myths and misconceptions concerning Einstein's theory of relativity. At that place, the person who deals with that website, Hurst, informs us it is widely held that Newtonian mechanics requires an absolute space and that Einstein's special theory of relativity did away with that need. There are 2 reasons why this myth may have arisen. When Newton defined the laws of mechanics, he considered space to be absolute. At the time that Einstein formulated his theory, it was generally held that there was an absolute state of rest, which was defined by the luminescence ether, which can be spelt 2 ways. However, it does not follow from these that Newtonian mechanics requires an absolute space. The concept of relativity was originated by Galileo a few hundred years before Einstein. At that time, it was known as Galilean invariance. Newtonian mechanics is and always was wholly compatible with Galilean invariance, and the combination of them is known as Newtonian relativity. So basically what you're saying is the principal relativity is compatible with Newtonian mechanics. And as I've already pointed out from a quote from Wikipedia, principal relativity in Newtonian mechanics and special relativity is the same principle. So once again, we get the idea from these clues that what is said about relativity having no preferred frame is a myth. A myth created by those misunderstanding relativity from its origins with Galileo to Newton and then to Einstein. It is thus highly annoying if there is a majority who declare their belief in relativity, we should call the relativists, and they don't actually believe relativity, but instead are believing myths. Because talking to them is then a doomed process. They will say things that are false about relativity and contrary to what relativity really is. So relativists believe myths about relativity, and they're not really dealing with proper relativity in most cases. Pointing out what Wikipedia said once again, as per Wikipedia, several myths of relativity have been successfully applied throughout science, whether implicitly as in Newtonian mechanics or explicitly as in Einstein's special relativity and general relativity. So more than one principle of relativity. We could then say that the version of principal relativity where there is no preferred frame is false, while other versions might be okay. Now move on to what Spoot says again. And this is Spoot. He's an American astrophysicist, cosmologist, and Nobel laureate. And he points out that one problem to overcome was the strong prejudice of good scientists who learned the lesson of the Michelson and Morley experiment and special relativity, that there was no preferred frame of reference. There was an education job to convince them that this did not violate special relativity. So really, physics students are being falsely taught that there is no preferred frame. And it's now a re-education job to teach them that that is a falsehood. So the relativity principle needs sorting out. The statement that there's no preferred frame is a myth and it's false. Whether it can get the majority of relativists to accept that they believe myths about relativity is another matter. Belief in myths can be very strong in people and they want to carry on believing them whatever. But what you got in relativity is people believing things that are false, and they be taught things that are false. The end.